So Stephen King's bad at endings, and I am bad at intros. I am Daniel Greene, and today I will be interviewing a huge influence for my channel, someone who I respect immensely here on YouTube, Tim, aka Hello Future Me. How's it going, Tim?
I am good. Thank you for having me on your incredible channel that I actually only recently just discovered.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm very happy you discovered it because I've been following you for a while, and I love the content you put out. I saw one comment recently that said, "As Daniel is Wheel of Time, Hello Future Me is Avatar," and that was actually one of the ones that finally pushed me to go and watch it because I was like, "All right, I need to get this under my belt and see how I enjoy it." So thank you for getting me into Avatar: The Last Airbender. I greatly enjoyed it.
I'm really happy that you watched it. I think that's sort of the mission of my channel, just to spread the word what's the word to spread, evangelize about Avatar. Yeah, that's my personal mission. And you liked it, which is even better.
Yeah,
you know?
I really did. It's funny, I remember watching it when I was young and loving it, and going in as an adult, I had this pit in my stomach, like, it's not going to be as good as I remember, I'm going to hate it, and of course I had criticisms, I criticize everything, but I really enjoyed it, and I was more just impressed at how mature it treated its audience. Excuse my neighbor, he's very obnoxious with his engine. But it was so wonderful to see a world so meticulously crafted, but still treating its audience like they're adults. And I think that's why it's aged so well, that everyone at all ages really can enjoy that adventure with Aang and his buddies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, whenever I get the criticism that Avatar's a kids show, I'm like, show me another kids show where episode 3 you find a mass grave of dead bodies after a genocide.
Yeah, I'm kind of still in shock they got away with as much as they did for Nickelodeon. Like, it's some of it's jarring, some of it's kind of like, wow, that shouldn't. All right, that's a lofty theme for a kid to try to take in.
Yeah, some of it gets pretty dark. It's but yeah, I mean, the show's got an incredibly special place in my heart, like Wheel of Time has in yours.
If I can one day convince you to read Wheel of Time, I'll have died happy. But that's
it is such an investment.
Don't worry, I am a very big advocate for large fantasy series are not for everybody. I am not one of these people who's trying to shove Malazan down everyone's throats.
Oh, I get that recommended to me all the time, and I'd never heard of it before I started doing this.
Yeah, it's as Wheel of Time is huge, Malazan is like when you pull out from a planet and you see a solar system. It's like that kind of scale up. It's truly massive, and I'm not talking page count. I'm just talking mythos and everything accomplished.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got the Silmarillion right here, but just always on my desk. So I'm not a stranger to large mythos, but those books are big scale.
That actually leads me to a nice segue to a video you put out today, which I really loved, covering on world building. It's really magnificent. Oh, yeah. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that because you've continually showed a deep knowledge of Middle-earth on your channel. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know, when did you get into Lord of the Rings, and what other fantasy would your fans be surprised to hear that you have gotten into? Final Fantasy to Stephen King to Lord of the Rings, where have you gone?
I got into Middle-earth. The Hobbit was the first book that I really read. I read that when I was 7 years old, and I just absolutely loved it. I fell in love with that particular world, and pretty much from that point onward, I read everything. I tried to read the Silmarillion in year 7, so I would have been 12, and I couldn't do it. I was not old enough. I was not meant to read it. You sort of a kid can't really understand that it's not a book that's meant to be read for its story. It's a history book in its own world. It's not written in that way that we typically digest books. Which to a 12-year-old...
it reads like the driest parts of the Bible. It's...
Yeah. There's literal begats in there.
Yeah.
And as for other fantasy series, so the fantasy series that every young boy fell into around 10 to 12 was obviously the Inheritance cycle. I really fell into that, and I loved the first, second, and third book.
Wow.
Um,
I didn't know it had that big an international audience. I knew it was big in America. I hadn't heard people in Europe or in New Zealand talking about it that much yet. So that's interesting to hear.
oh, I mean, like, I don't know. It was kind of a big phenomenon for young fantasy for me. But I mean, I might it just might be my perspective, my limited perspective there. But I read that multiple times. I was really into that. Followed it up. Artemis Fowl was a series that I followed from a young kid right up to its final book. And only recently have I got into Brandon Sanderson, The Way of Kings, Mistborn, those books, which you're very familiar with. And
Well, outside of even books, I mean, you clearly have a very deep knowledge from a few things I've seen you pull from, including, obviously, the low-hanging fruit there is Avatar. But
low-hanging fruit.
you also recently mentioned Handmaid's Tale on your channel, which is a series
Yes.
I have loved. I've not picked up the book, though, and it's been brilliant to get into. Cinematography on that show is outstanding. So have you had, do you like dystopian in general, or is that just something that caught your eye?
So, The Handmaid's Tale, I didn't read till I was in university, because I did an essay on it. And it's written, it's honestly not written in a particularly compellingly driven way. But I do love The Handmaid's Tale because it's a really great example of an interesting passive character. And passive characters being characters who react to the plot rather than drive the plot.
Right.
More so. Offred is very much that. And in the TV series, you get that. She is confined by the story around her and forced to react to it, basically. And so when it comes to dystopian series, I've never been a dystopian reader. I've read The Hunger Games. I've read the first Divergent book. I've read the classic dystopians, 1984, Brave New World.
Any Fahrenheit 451?
I haven't read Fahrenheit 451.
Okay, that's my all-time favorite dystopian.
I've heard it's really good, so I do want to read it at some point. And I think I prefer the older dystopian stories because I think they have more interesting themes to me. And I think that the themes of dystopian stories are where I get sold on a book, and modern dystopian stories don't tend to grab me as much. Simply a world being really bad without interesting social commentary that I find particularly relevant to me.
Yeah, it's an interesting transition I've noticed in the genre where it's gone from being about ideas and themes to just characters within dystopian. And it's one of the few genres where I'm like, that can't work so well because the inherently interesting thing about dystopian is the world. You want to know what's going on, why, and it's like, Katniss is great, but I'd much rather hear about the transition into this world than just hear about her.
It's interesting. So, The Hunger Games is probably what would you describe it as like one of those cornerstone dystopian books in the genre that sort of sprung everything out of dozens of other similar books?
Yeah.
You'd say that's fair?
Without a doubt. It's a cornerstone for teen fiction and modern dystopian. It's shaped all those things because, money. It's the biggest successful of the genre in the last few decades, so it's going to have a tidal wave of copycats, which we've already seen.
What I find really interesting about the Hunger Games series is that, did you ever read Mockingjay?
Oh, I think I got halfway through it, if I'm being completely honest.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. What I find interesting is that the Hunger Games series, and Mockingjay in particular, actually does something in terms of world building, or writing, I suppose, that is really accurate and really interesting that most of these other dystopian books that sort of sprung out of it never did, which is that when the revolution came, the capital was already weak. They just walked into the capital, and that was a criticism of the book because it didn't feel like there was any tension. They didn't struggle that much. But the reality is that most revolutions, when they actually succeed, happen to already crumbling societies. Like Katniss, it wasn't a story where the young girl goes and saves the world because she's the chosen one. Katniss is actually sidelined for the entire book because she's just becomes an icon. She's used as a way to propel the revolution forward, but she's not actually doing that much. And I feel that's really interesting because later dystopian books don't do that.
That is interesting, and absolutely from a historical perspective correct. I mean, you don't have the Nazi Party arise out of a weak, just strong Germany. You have it arise out of an economically shattered one, because that's just the way it happens. Rome didn't fall at its peak. That's not.
No.
Yeah, exactly.
Revolutions don't happen when states are at their height of power.
So I want to ask a question here that I want to ask everybody I interview. What are you currently reading, and what have you read recently that's really stuck out to you?
Okay, so what I'm reading recently isn't actually a fantasy or sci-fi book.
Totally allowed.
It is it is Ned Vizzini's It's Kind of a Funny Story.
Okay.
And that's because when I'm writing, which I haven't written for a long time, I tend to read books that are in a similar sort of writing style to what I'm trying to emulate, or at least issues that I'm targeting.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm reading a whole bunch of books which have to do with mental health and some sort of introspective first-person stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Books that I've read recently that have stuck out to me, Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey. It's the book that the TV series on Netflix, which is called The Expanse, is based on.
Okay.
I've never seen the series, but I've read the book, and it was really good.
Okay.
And I really enjoyed that. It was a good, hard sci-fi novel with really interesting world building, based in this world where there's sort of a cold war between Mars and Earth, and the asteroid belt is sort of caught in the middle. And then other books that I've read recently that I really liked. It's not super recent, but I did actually read The Way of Kings earlier this year. So
that sticks out to most people who read it.
Yeah. I really did enjoy it. In the last third of it was really, really good.
So you write. So okay, for those of you who don't know, Hello Future Me does these. Tim here, I just referred to you as your channel. That's weird.
It's weird when people email me and they go, hello, future me.
So he does wonderful video essays here, pulling apart world building and all kinds of interesting aspects of writing. And I've wanted to ask you, since I pretty much saw the first video of yours, what mindset do you take when you approach one of these videos? Are you coming from it as an academic, as a fan, as kind of a mixture? What is your process in how I want to break down making a magic system or crafting world building?
So I write all of my videos as pretty much academic essays. Mm-hmm. I structure them in the same way as I learned, or at least similar, because it's video, it's a little bit different. But fundamentally, I write it as an essay. Using the academic structure that I've learned at university, and I try to take a really narrow topic, because one thing that I've always wanted to do with my channel is never simplify things or be really brief with them, go into the amount of detail necessary to be helpful, which is what I find a lot of writing advice isn't. It's often very broad and very non-specific to the point of not being that helpful.
Okay.
So, that's sort of the style I was going for. I approach it as an analyst, not so much as a fan, but I do draw from things that I'm a fan of more easily, that I know a lot more deeply than I do things that I'm less familiar with.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have a nice balance typically, I find, of preference versus objectivism, where you'll say, I enjoy this, but there's also this and this. You recently did that in your world building video, where it's, here's what I like, but there's also these approaches. Something that as a reviewer, I've tried to do better and better, because it's really easy to say, this is bad, here's why, and not say, that's my opinion, here's what's good, and here's what's objectively bad. Is that something you've kind of evolved over time with, or from day one did you set out saying, okay, I need to separate what I like versus what is more the tried and true objective way of doing these things?
I guess it's something I did deliberately choose to do early on. And it's really good. I've watched a number of your reviews. I feel you're pretty objective, and you acknowledge where your sort of preference versus objective stuff is.
Appreciate it.
So, I think you're very clear about that. It is something I deliberately chose to do, and I think I've always had a focus on saying on not using the word should, like you should do this, because I find that writing advice uses that too often when it's just not really that accurate for most advice. Like, even saying you should use the 3-act structure, it's like, well, I mean, there are lots of different other types of structures that you can use, and also, if you're just writing fanfic because you really, really like, having your characters get together even though they really should not be in the canon, then is the 3-act structure that important? It's more just acknowledging this is what is conventionally enjoyed by most people, and this is why people typically advise it. So here's that advice, which is good advice, because if you're going for writing a book which a lot of people are going to enjoy, probably stick with that, because this is tried and tested. But there's also this other stuff. You can do it differently if you have other desires. If you really want to have a super detailed world written into your book that's going to slow down the pacing, but you love doing the world building stuff, that's really important for your piece of work, why not do that,
I like that. I can echo that mentality of just do what feels right for you, and to hell with what other people say, because there's a lot of authors I've read out there who clearly caved when an editor came in and said you need to change this, because it starts feeling formulaic. It starts feeling like this isn't a product of someone's brain. This is someone playing it safe and trying to hit what they think is marketable, which I can always feel like I can always tell when that's happening.
That's a skill. I don't think I can tell. I'm not that smart.
Well, I mean,
but that's
just pick up a book like a Song of Ice and Fire. There's no way George R. R. Martin caved there. He went with what was not proven to work, what's not proven to sell, and he showed it could.
There's this passage in the book where Sir Barristan, and this is a feature of the series that I love, which is that characters are walking through somewhere, and they'll recall parts of their history that are like relevant to sort of what they're seeing and stuff like that. It's just sort of those sort of side. It's basically just little side notes about the world and the characters that sort of stop in the middle of the action. I love that, even though I know it's not what you'd advise. Like, but there's Sir Barristan's walking through a thing and he sees a tapestry and he goes on this like 6-page story about how he rescued the Mad King from Duskendale, I think it is.
Well, that's the kind of thing where I will never say you're objectively wrong. That was something actually when I interviewed Chad, he brought up, was he was always trying to find the balance of how can I say this versus how I want it versus how someone will enjoy it. And what I always will tell people is write it how you want it, and trust me, that one thing's not going to make or break the book. And do put the things in your story that really make it feel like it's yours. Because I, as a reader, really like when there's a flair to something that I always can stand out. Like, there's the most extreme example that's so popular right now is Brandon Sander's Magic Systems. I mean, he is going to put that time and effort in. And I feel like if anyone told him stop, don't, he would rather burn his book than put it out. It's going to be there, and it feels like you're reading a Brandon Magic System. And then there's Gentleman Bastards, which puts so much time and effort into crafting the feel of this city and this world, and that feels so much like a Scott Lynch thing. And I never want someone to not do that because they're afraid, I like this, but I don't think others will. If someone had told, Tolkien, no one's going to give a crap about the Silmarillion, we're not going to care about all these histories.
Well, they did.
Yeah, they did. That's true.
He tried to publish that first, and they told him no.
Which, okay, the order of publishing was important there, and I do feel like that was the right call.
He thought the Silmarillion was going to be the big seller.
No.
Tolkien.
He also wanted The Lord of the Rings to be one book, which they split into 3, which I do feel like, again, was the right choice. Publishers can make the right choices. That is a true thing. That does happen.
I have it as a one book, though. It's this beautiful big red one. It's out in the other room, but it's a beautiful book, and I love it. And it's got all the maps and all of the language and all the translations, and I love it.
Have you seen the original Tolkien maps he drew of Middle-earth?
Yes, though, to be honest, I can't actually recall off the top of my head which one he actually drew because I've seen so many. I know the one for The Hobbit, but not for the for Middle Earth.
It's the one with a ton of notes covering it. It's the one with red pen all over it with him being like, okay, this is that, just going nuts. And I think it's a beautiful reflection of his brain. You can just tell that he's going over it so detailed, so carefully. I appreciate that.
Yep. And then forevermore, we got fantasy maps with a western coast.
Yes. I mean, that's the one thing. I love fantasy maps. I really do. I think there's something so beautiful about them. But so many of them are just, yep, that's Middle-earth 5.0.
That's, yep. Yep, no, definitely. I totally get you there. That's something you notice after a while. Brandon Sanderson does his maps really interestingly, though.
Yeah, Roshar has this wonderful twirl to it that I find just, magnificent.
Storm.
Yeah. And then Westeros, obviously, and its connection to the other continent, that stands out as very different. But George R.R. Martin, he's trying to go so against fantasy that it makes sense that his map would stand out so much. So that actually brings up something I wanted to touch on again. Avatar has a wonderful map physically and a wonderful world as it's built. So I'm going to be honest. Before we started this call, I went over a lot of the mythology of Avatar again because I wanted to at least be up to refreshed. So this is a world which is praised for having nuanced lore and beautiful history to it. So why do you think? I don't know. Maybe this is a bad way to phrase this question. Why do you think it's rare to see something that feels so different in its world building presented to a younger audience? I don't want to say for kids, because I don't feel like Avatar is for kids, but I, for one, when I was younger, remember loving books or stories that had a more complex world to them, and it feels like the Avatar world's a diamond in the rough when it comes to stories made for younger readers.
So, you're asking why you feel kind of like more mature, great world building shows are so rare?
Yeah, when presented for kids. Yeah, or for I don't know. I don't want to say for kids. I want to say for mass audiences.
I would say it's because people like you and I are a minority, and I don't take A Song of Ice and Fire. Mm-hmm. I don't think that it became such a phenomenon necessarily because of its great world building. Like, the TV series didn't take off because of that. I think it took off because it managed to be fantasy for people who never would have normally watched it. It was a historical drama, it was a war series, and it was, high production value. And while there's obviously world building that sort of underpins all of that, I don't think that having great world building is necessarily going to sell to mass audiences. So there isn't the same motivation. And that's really sad. Because obviously now studios have realized that these grand worlds are going to do sell because Game of Thrones, and now we're getting the Wheel of Time series and a new Avatar series and a new Lord of the Rings series, and I'm pretty sure there's like 5 other grand fantasy series in the works. I don't even know anymore. But
it's a lot more than just 5.
Oh, great.
It's a tidal wave.
As long as they don't pump up the Sword of Shannara to that. No.
Yeah. Let's not talk about Shannara and what happened with there. So I actually disagree a little bit. I think it's well known marketably that big worlds sell. I mean, if you just look at kids or even a lot of adults, the amount of adults now who I know who never gave a crap about fantasy or anything, but it latched onto A Song of Ice and Fire's world and now care so much. And not every huge world is going to sell 1 million billion copies or be super successful on TV. But I do think that if you do have a series with a big world and it blows up, having that big world and mythology will help it grow so much more. Because you have the psychotic nerds like us who are going to make a ton of content around it, bring more people in. It's like it has a wider net because there's so much more to get people engaged. You get people who like the characters in, you get people who like history in, you get people who like lore and religion in. To me, it's just confusing. Yeah. Like, if I was going to write a fantasy series that was going to be put on Cartoon Network or Toonami. I don't know if that's still a thing, but if it is, it's awesome. I would make a lot of time and effort to have this wider world hinted to. and give a lot of time and effort into that.
No, I think you're right to an extent. But then again, I mean, you do have to throw out the question of how many good fantasy and sci-fi series have there been until the last few years. I mean,
that's a fair point.
We've had a few sci-fi series. You know, there's been the Star Treks and the Stargates, and there's been the occasional series, but I feel like fantasy is a bit plagued in its past by really bad TV executions, and you know, like Lord of the Rings was, I think, as far as I know, one of the first really big fantasy hits, like in a film.
It was without a doubt the biggest up to that time. But you have to remember there was the 1-2 punch in that time period of Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter. I mean, fantasy got boosted twice.
That's true. That's true.
It got proven to be... It's really interesting how it got proven to be marketable to an adult audience and a younger audience.
And that really changed. It changed the landscape. Like, really it did. Like... Yeah. You can't underestimate the way that Harry Potter and I guess Lord of the Rings, the film series, fundamentally changed how like studios have approached making films and TV.
And it's very arguable that A Song of Ice and Fire is having an equally large impact right now.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know if you've heard about this, but Amazon's budget for the Lord of the Rings show is, for the whole show, it's $1 billion. For season 1, they're doing $20 million an episode, which is just, oh my God. Yeah, per episode.
20 million. And I'm so worried about what they're going to do.
Well, the second age. The second age is confirmed.
I know. Yeah. They're not allowed to touch stuff, if I remember rightly. They've got entitlement to the appendices and some of the Silmarillion?
Yes, I believe so. They just can't touch anything that is the third age. That's basically the cutoff.
Basically, okay. See, the problem is that even though Tolkien did a ton of world building, most of that information that we have about the second and first stages, it's said very shortly, as in it'll say, and a character went to a place and he found a thing, and then he married the love of his life, and then he died in a thing. And they'll do that all in the space of a page quite often. There aren't that many stories in the Second Age that have enough detail in the sense that like A Song of Ice and Fire did, which has like... Basically, you could adapt scenes of the script into the series, and they did that, you know, for a lot of it. Tolkien's writing doesn't have that. And so they're either going to add in a lot, which is going to lead to criticism, or they're going to do it, if they did it really accurately, then I don't know what it's going to look like, because some of the stuff in there looks pretty weird.
He's not exactly, at least it's not the first age, because the first age would be bonkers to try and bring to the screen, especially some of the stuff with, dragons and they're the size of cities.
Well, there's like battles where, like 7 elves are taking on 12 dragons and the Balrogs are riding dragons. The Balrogs ride dragons!
Yeah, it's a little nuts.
And then he's like dueling, like Fingolfin? Was it Fingolfin that like duels a giant god-like being, and who's like he's like 50 meters tall. How are they going to depict that in like a way that people don't laugh? Like,
yeah, it's one of those things where it's very cool to read, like, oh, that's awesome, and then you're like, now let's put it on the screen. Yeah, not quite there. So as someone who's I'd say it's fair to say a big Lord of the Rings Middle-earth fan, are you happy to hear that the estate is so involved and they essentially have veto power on creative decisions?
Now, I'm not going to say it's a good thing, I don't think. And the reason for that is that the Tolkien estate is, broadly speaking, their main interest has been not letting things be changed or used, like go too far from Tolkien's original vision. Mm-hmm. And as I said before, I don't necessarily think that adapting it strictly is going to work. Mm-hmm. Like there's a very short tale of a civil war, a Gondorian civil war, where you get like a paragraph of knowledge about it. Basically, two families that's called the Kinstrife, and they go to war with one another, and there's one battle at Osgiliath, and then he dies, I'm pretty sure. The guy that like led the uprising. Mm-hmm. And like you could expand that into a really interesting story, but theoretically the Tolkien estate could just be like, no, you have to have only what we pretty much depict, in which case has to take place over like an episode. Like
yeah. Well, they could do like an episode as a story. Like they could do, here's the short story, we'll do 50 minutes on it, and then we're off to the next thing. I mean, they could hop like that. It would be strange.
It would be very strange.
With a $20 million budget, and I'm sure half of Hollywood clamoring to be involved with the show, though.
$20 million? Yeah. That is so much money!
Well, here's even crazier. Did you hear how much they had to pay the Tolkien estate to even do this show?
300 million?
250 million. So $250 million. Yeah.
Wow, that is.
Which also begs the question: how much money does Amazon have? Okay. So you have a book published, which we have to talk about here. If you have not checked out Hello Future Me's book, it's absolutely wonderful. If you'd like to do a plug for it, because I actually have it and I've been reading it, and it's great.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's... Hang on, I've got them over here. Give me a second. Yeah, it's a book on writing and world building, and it's sold like nearly 10,000 copies so far, which is insane.
That is amazing.
Yeah, it's clearly picked up an audience outside of just YouTube, and it's basically just got a whole bunch of stuff on the how to write and structure and world build, mostly topics that I've covered on my channel. And then it's got a couple of extra things and extra notes that were never put into the videos themselves. But I'm glad you're enjoying it. Thank you for letting me plug it.
So I have to ask, so you went through the publishing process, but you weren't doing a fantasy book. Now, I've talked to people who have published fantasy books, and they have strong opinions on the publishing process. For a nonfiction, more of a educational book, how was the publishing process for you? What route did you take?
Well, so I did self-publishing very purposely with this book.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that when I do my first fiction book, I want to make sure that it actually goes well. This is ultimately a lot less work, and I've poured a lot less love and labor into it than I would my first fiction book, where I crafted everything, in a to be a very emotional and interesting narrative experience. There's a lot more of me in that. I wanted to know how the self-publishing process worked. But I wanted to essentially test it with something that was lower risk for me.
That's really smart.
Something that I knew would already have an audience, and something that if it did flop, because I screwed up the process, which is very easy to do, it wouldn't be as much of a heartbreak for me. So I found the publishing process relatively easy overall. I want to go with a traditional publisher for my first fiction book, but for these books, I will probably just self-publish them.
Oh, interesting. Well, it's worked out well from you, it sounds. And that's got to be immensely rewarding. But I'm also very excited to hear that you are planning a fiction book. Can you tell me anything about that, or is that completely under wraps?
Okay, so what can I share about it? I've been very cagey just because... if I say anything, then people remember it and archive it forever now. So
don't do that.
So, okay, what can I tell you? To the shock of a lot of people, which is probably going to be very disappointing to a lot of people, because I know that so much of my audience is all about fantasy and sci-fi. My first book is not going to be fantasy or sci-fi, really.
Okay.
There is a sci-fi element to it. To call it a science fiction book would be misleading, though. So, yeah. I really enjoy exploring things to do with mental health and characters who struggle with that on a really gritty level. And part of the book is being written in response to bad tropes that I've seen in other books.
I love hearing that.
So, yeah. So that's what I'll say. It starts with a guy appearing in an alternate reality that he wanted to go to.
Interesting. So, will there be firebending in this alternate reality?
As much as I would love to go there, no, there is no firebending in this alternate reality.
So I get asked all the time if I could go to any fantasy world, which one would I go to? The clear and honest response is none of them, because I would not be a magic user and I would die. So I'm not going to go to any of them.
Yep. Yeah. No, totally get you there.
Yeah. But no, that sounds interesting. And of course, don't divulge anything you do not want to. I never want to pressure people, especially as someone who's also writing something. I hate when I get questions like, tell me what this is going. You said this 6 months ago. Is this still happening? I'll be angry if it's not. And I'm like, stop.
Yeah, there's a lot of expectation, and if you give out more information about it, then it develops more of an expectation. So I've been trying to avoid that, but basically I can now work on the book, which is really cool. I haven't been able to in ages, and I'm hoping to sort of have that done mid next year.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
On getting into
Don't quote me on that, though.
So, his book will be released middle of the year next year.
Yeah.
All right, so let's, if you don't mind, I won't take up too much more of your time here. You're a busy guy, but I would like to transition the talk into more of just YouTube talk in general.
Yeah.
You and I have been. It's funny. I don't like to say I'm in a relationship with YouTube. It's a battle with YouTube. That is quite interesting. And you recently showed that you had some fraudulent, not legitimate copyright strikes and claims against you. But you seem to have resolved at least some, if not most, of what happened. Would you mind going over what went down?
Okay, so I was at the gym one time. Then I started checking my emails. And I got one claim on a video. And I was like, okay, that sucks, but it's an older video, you know, it happens. I get a claim every couple of months, and most of the time I just let it go because it's not really making any money anymore, and a lot of the time it's borderline, not necessarily going to dispute it. But then I started getting more emails, one every 3-4 minutes, and Sony was going through and claiming video after video after video after video until I lost about 10% of my videos total claimed. And that included ones which were definitely fair use. And I've never followed the kind of dispute process right through to counter notification. It's sort of a bit too terrifying, but this time I was like, nah, I'm going to do it. Talked to a lawyer. A couple of lawyers got in contact with me, clearly, so that was really nice of them. And they walked me through some stuff. Now, I do have a law degree, so I'm not, like, entirely dumb to all of this.
That came out of nowhere, but all right. Very cool. That's impressive.
I have a law degree and an arts degree with 2 majors. But I understand fair use. Like, I've studied it for 2 semesters. Like, it's not foreign to me. But pretty much got confirmation that these videos were definitely fair use, and I followed those through to the final steps. And basically, what I've found is that Sony is just going to let the claims time out. They don't actually accept them. They're just going to let them run out, which is really annoying because it means it takes way longer for me. I haven't actually resolved most of them yet. I'm about to, in a couple of days' time, Sony's first claim, the Sony's claim that I am disputing first, which is my on-writing Magic Systems video.
That's one of my favorite videos of yours, just putting that out there.
Yeah. Well, it's one of my bigger ones. That claim is going to probably expire, and that will tell me that Sony, when you take it that far, just let claims expire. They don't actually take a video down. Because I wanted to figure out an experiment what actually happens when I take them that far first. And once I've done that, I'm going to appeal again on 2 of my other videos, which are clearly fair use, and then I'm going to work my way down slowly until I've got all of the ones back that really matter to me, which are my on-writing videos that they took wrongly, and a couple of ones which are like ones I worked super hard on, like including the biggest video I've ever done, which is on Azula's psychology that they took, which is unbelievably frustrating.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I did see one of yours was released back to you.
That was by Warner
Twitter.
Brothers.
Okay.
Warner
that was a
Brothers, they did
one.
another claim. They did a separate claim. I disputed it, and they released it in like 3 days. So kudos to them.
Thank you, Warner Brothers.
Yeah, thank you, Warner Brothers. Yeah.
I'll be sure to contact you to be my lawyer if it ever happens.
I am not a lawyer. I need to put that disclaimer out there. Yeah.
And it's not cool, but to hear something, a company like Sony seems to be a part of the problem as well is very
I've heard Sony
sad.
is particularly notorious for it, which really sucks. And the stupid thing is that what they're claiming, they own the soundtrack to a video game of the series that I'm talking about.
Okay.
Which is like 3 levels of separation.
God. Oh, man. So did you have that soundtrack in the video?
No. That's the thing.
Oh, my God.
I'm not using the soundtrack. What they're technically claiming is the background music in clips that I use.
Okay.
That's what they're claiming.
Which is not a part of the video game.
Well, no. The soundtrack in the video game is the same soundtrack used in clips in the actual series.
Okay.
They are claiming the soundtrack that they have a right to in the video game that is used in the series, because it's from the series, in the clip in the clip that I'm using, because I can't remove it. It's part of the clip.
Mm-hmm.
Which is... Ugh.
Yeah, that's so not good.
Yeah.
Sorry to hear about that. Yeah.
It's
Luckily,
the life of what we do, right? It's just a thing. Are you writing a book, by the way? I wanted to ask that.
Yes, I am, and I've put out my first short story, which is on my Patreon. Go check out the Patreon if you have not already.
Do it.
Yeah. And it's also narrated by Murphy Napier, so there's also a narration, and I'll do a narration of the next book, or next short story. But yes, I am. Unfortunately, because I'm technically working 3 jobs right now, aside from writing, not much progress has been made recently. I will now be working 2 jobs starting September 20th, which I'm very excited about. So I'll actually might have some writing time. But yes, it's happening. It's a flintlock fantasy, which means there's pew-pew bangs in it. It's going to be mostly taking place on boats. And it's inspired by the ideas
Mostly
of
take place on boats.
That's as much as I'm willing to say. I'm taking inspiration from the Age of Exploration and the ideas of Manifest Destiny that led to so much slaughter and horrendous.
Oh, hang on!
World.
No, you told me about this. I'm so sorry. I forgot.
You're good. I was sitting here like, we talked about this, but it's all right.
I'm so sorry.
No,
yes.
it's totally fine.
Yeah.
But the writing process is one of the most stressful but also simultaneously relaxing things I've ever done in my life, where it feels so good to write, but every line I write, I'm like, do I want that, though?
Yeah. So how can I make it not bad?
That is something I've asked myself about most things I've done in my life.
Well, it's great that you're writing, and I look forward to buying it one day. And
I'll send you a signed copy, and
I would love that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the channel, Tim. I almost just called you Hello Future Me again. That is not your name. I'm hoping in the future that we will see an evil version of you start a channel called Goodbye Past Self, and that is what I am hoping for.
Or just like an emo phase, like
there you
Goodbye Past Self. That'll be even better.
Yeah, but if you have not checked out Hello Future Me, the channel, not the man Tim, you just met the man here, please do. Some of the best thoughts and ideas, essays on writing, world building, fantasy, fiction I've come across on the platform, and definitely worth a subscribe. And I highly recommend his book as well. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. Your channel's awesome. Great actually talking to you, and hope we can do some more work in the future.
Have a good one, y'all. Peace.